The wagons of Pharaoh roll to a halt at the wells of Beersheba, and an old man refuses to go one step further south. He has just survived 2 decades of a grief that nearly buried him alive. He has just been handed the impossible news that his murdered son, Joseph, is alive and ruling an empire. The royal transport is waiting to carry him to the boy he wept over, but Jacob stops. He builds an altar in the dust, slaughters his cattle, and waits in the heavy silence of the border. Why did a patriarch who once wrestled an angel in the dark suddenly paralyze with fear at the exact moment his deepest sorrow was about to be undone? Picture it. The dust settling around Egyptian wheels, the smell of wood smoke and blood rising into a Canaanite night. The entire camp is waiting for the order to march, but the patriarch will not move. Genesis chapter 46, verses 1 through 3, in the King James Version, gives us the jarring reality of this moment. And Israel took his journey with all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt. Stop right there. Fear not. Read that again. The text explicitly names the emotion locking his feet to the ground. Fear. Not exhaustion, not logistical delay, absolute dread. But fear of what? This is a man who faced down his murderous brother, Esau. This is a man who survived his treacherous uncle, Laban. This is a man who slept on a stone and watched a ladder touch heaven. Yet here, standing at the southern edge of his territory, he freezes. To understand the sheer weight of this hesitation, we have to look past the English summary. There is an older Jewish text, the Book of Jubilees, called by the early church the Little Genesis, preserved whole for centuries inside the Ethiopian Bible. I offer it as that. One tradition's record. Jubilees records the exact date of this halt. It tells us, Jacob celebrated the harvest festival at Beersheba, but then wept bitterly as the reality of leaving Canaan set in. Jubilees shows us a man standing on the knife's edge of a curse. See the scene. Beersheba is not just a rest stop on a trade route. It is the absolute southernmost boundary of the promised land. One more step, and his foot leaves the inheritance of Abraham. The altar he builds here is not just a gesture of gratitude for Joseph's life. It is an emergency flare shot into a silent heaven. God has not spoken to Jacob since the day Joseph's bloody coat was dropped at his feet. 22 years of dead air, 22 years of heaven saying nothing. And now, standing on the edge of the exile, Jacob needs to know if leaving Canaan means abandoning the covenant entirely. The Egyptian wagons are idling in the dark, waiting for a patriarch who is terrified of the geography right in front of him. But the fear anchoring Jacob to the dirt of Beersheba did not start with him, nor did it start with Joseph. Whose nightmare is he actually afraid of walking into? Decades before Jacob was ever born, a deep sleep fell upon his grandfather in the hill country. Not a peaceful rest. Genesis 15 calls it an horror of great darkness. In that pitch-black trance, God tore the veil back on the future of the chosen bloodline and handed Abraham a terrifying timeline. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Stop right there. 400 years. That is the terror. That is the invisible wall keeping Jacob in Canaan. Every patriarch knew this decree. The covenant of greatness came with a staggering, unavoidable tax. 4 centuries of chains, of whip cracks, of a foreign sun beating down on the backs of their children. Jacob knows that stepping across the southern border pulls the trigger on the nightmare. To go to Egypt is to start the clock on the slavery of his own descendants. Picture the weight of it. The Egyptian wagons are built of heavy timber, carrying the seal of Pharaoh, waiting at the edge of the camp. They are a rescue mission for the famine. But Jacob looks at them and sees the iron furnace. The book of Jasher, an ancient Hebrew midrash exploring the histories between the lines of Genesis, describes this exact tension. Jasher tells us that the dread of the Egyptian descent haunted the patriarchs, a shadow they could never outrun. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But Jasher paints Jacob not merely as a father desperate for a reunion, but as a shepherd terrified of sentencing his unborn great-grandchildren to the dark. He knew the Hebrew word God spoke to Abraham for what would happen to them. Anah, to bow down, to depress, to brutalize. Reading, not inventing. He is doing the math in the dust of Beersheba. If he stays inside the borders of Canaan, does he delay the slavery? Does he starve in the famine just to keep his sons out of the shackles? Sit with that. He is choosing between the death of his family by starvation or their survival by enslavement. This is why he slaughters the cattle. This is why the altar goes up. He is begging the God of the covenant to tell him if this is the moment the horror begins. But the dirt of Beersheba holds another secret, one that makes stepping out of Canaan even more dangerous. Because Jacob is standing on the exact geographic coordinates where heaven once gave his family a very specific, ironclad prohibition. 2 generations of history. 1 stretch of desert. But Jacob is not the first man in his family to face a famine at this border, and he remembers exactly what God told the man before him. What was the absolute command buried beneath the stones of Beersheba? 80 years earlier, another patriarch stood choking on the dust of a famine on this exact patch of dirt. The ground beneath Jacob's feet holds the ashes of an older altar. Before Jacob was ever Israel, his father Isaac brought his dying flocks to the edge of Beersheba, staring down a drought that was suffocating the land. Isaac looked south toward the overflowing granaries of the Nile, ready to cross the boundary line just to survive. But heaven shut the border. Genesis chapter 26, verse 2, records the absolute command that burned itself into the family memory. And the Lord appeared unto him, and said, Go not down into Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Stop right there. Go not down. The Hebrew verb is yarad, to descend, to sink. It is a word used not just for a drop in elevation, but a descent into the grave, a sinking into captivity. God drew a hard, invisible line in the sand of Beersheba and told Isaac that the covenant could only survive if he stayed inside the promised geography. Egypt was forbidden country. Same desert, same border, 2 generations apart. Isaac stayed, and the land yielded 100-fold. Now his son Jacob is standing on the identical geographic coordinates, facing a famine so severe it has broken the entire ancient world. The wagons of Pharaoh are idling right in front of him, explicitly inviting him to cross. Sit with that. Jacob is not just afraid of triggering the 400-year nightmare of his grandfather Abraham. He is terrified he is violating the direct, unyielding prohibition given to his father. To walk into Egypt is to break the perimeter Isaac was ordered to hold. It is to risk abandoning the inheritance entirely. Watch what the text does. Genesis says Jacob offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. He specifically invokes the man who was told to stay out of Egypt. He builds his fire on the memory of his father's obedience. There is an ancient Jewish Aramaic translation and commentary, the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, that amplifies the paralyzing fear of this moment. I hold this as one reading, one careful bridge across the text. The Targum reveals that Jacob trembled because leaving the promised land without permission meant leaving the divine presence behind. The Shekinah, the dwelling glory of the Creator, was tied to the soil of Canaan. If Jacob crossed the line into the pagan empire on his own authority, he believed the Spirit of God would stay behind at the border. Picture the patriarch kneeling by the slaughtered cattle, the blood soaking into the southern sand, the Egyptian drivers looking on, impatient, wondering why the old Hebrew is weeping in the dark, instead of hurrying to his royal son. Jacob will not move until the God who locked the border for Isaac physically unlocks it for him. He is waiting for a voice he has not heard since his heart broke, an altar of blood, a terrified father, a border that feels like a cliff edge. But the decades of crushing silence are about to shatter, and when the Creator finally speaks in the black of night, he does not just give an order. How does heaven finally answer the slaughter of the animals? The wood smoke drifts low over the encampment at Beersheba. The carcasses of the sacrificed cattle are still warm on the stones. For 22 years, the heavens over this patriarch's head have been pure iron. Since the afternoon, his older sons walked into his tent, carrying a tunic soaked in goat's blood. The voice of the Creator has been entirely absent from his life. 22 years of dead air. When they brought him the coat of many colors back in Genesis 37, he stared at the ruined fabric and screamed that an evil beast had devoured his boy. He anchored his soul to a lie. And for over 2 decades, heaven did not correct him. The book of Jasher captures the devastating weight of this span, recording that the spirit of prophecy departed from him the moment he surrendered to that absolute despair. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. A man cannot hear the whispers of eternity when his mind is buried in an empty grave. But tonight, the grave is empty for a different reason. Joseph is breathing. Joseph is ruling an empire, and the old man kneels at the border, staring at the embers of his own altar. Same family, different blood. The goat's blood broke him. The sacrificial blood is his final plea. He is waiting in the dark. He will let the royal wagons rot on their axles before he takes a step outside the covenant without hearing from the God of his fathers. Then the iron shatters. Genesis chapter 46, verse 2. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. Stop right there. Jacob, Jacob. The 22-year drought of revelation ends with a double invocation. In the Hebrew text, when God repeats a name back-to-back, Abraham. Abraham at the altar of Moriah. Moses. Moses at the burning bush. It is never casual. It is a divine emergency break. It is the language of total, immediate rescue. God steps into the terror of Beersheba and anchors the trembling father with his own name. Watch what the text does. Read that verse again, carefully. The King James preserves a jarring, deliberate paradox right in the middle of the sentence. The narrative text says God spoke unto Israel, but the voice out of the dark called him Jacob. Sit with that. 2 names, 1 man, colliding in the blackness of the border. Israel is the prince with God, the man who wrestled the angel until dawn and won a new identity. Israel is the man who had the faith to pack his tents and leave Hebron. But when the voice of God actually speaks from the shadows, it does not call out to the prince. It calls out to the frightened fugitive. Jacob, the heel catcher, the man who ran from his uncle, who cowered before his brother, who is now paralyzed at the edge of Egypt. God sees the faith of Israel, but he speaks directly to the fear of Jacob. 2 names hold the tension of a man terrified to leave the promised land. The long silence is broken, but the voice speaking from the dark uses the older, broken name to address the deep terror in his chest. What does the Creator say next to convince the heel-catcher to walk willingly into the furnace? The voice from the dark does not offer empty comfort. It offers absolute identity. The embers of the slaughtered cattle are glowing in the Beersheba sand, and the Creator of the universe is leaning into the terror of the old patriarch. He answers the dread of the boundary line by naming himself. Genesis chapter 46, verse 3. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. Stop right there. I am God. In the Hebrew text, the phrase is Ha-El, not a generic deity, the mighty one. But watch what the text does. He immediately attaches a specific human name to that infinite title, the God of thy father. God is explicitly invoking Isaac. He is standing on the exact geographic border where he once locked Isaac out of Egypt, and he is personally lifting the embargo for the son. Same desert, different decree. God is telling Jacob that crossing the line tonight is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of obedience. But then the voice in the dark pivots to address the second terror, the nightmare of Abraham, the 400 years of impending slavery. God does not deny the prophecy. He does not tell Jacob the chains will not come. Instead, he reveals the brutal, necessary purpose of the exile. For I will there make of thee a great nation. Read that again. The promise given to Abraham that his seed would be like the stars of heaven cannot be fulfilled in the open hills of Canaan. See the scene. Look past the altar, to the tents pitched in the dust. Jacob is leading exactly 70 souls. They are not a nation. They are a fragile clan of shepherds. If they stay in the promised land during a global famine, they will either starve to death or be entirely assimilated by the pagan Canaanites around them. They need an incubator. They need a border wall where they can multiply in isolation. Moses will later look back in Deuteronomy 4 and call Egypt the iron furnace. You do not put metal into a furnace to destroy it. You put it in a furnace to forge it. Egypt is not just a prison. It is the womb of the Hebrew nation. Look closely at the command that pushes him toward the fire. Fear not to go down. The Hebrew phrase is al-tira mireda. The root of that word is yarad, to descend, to sink, the exact same verb that held Isaac back. The curse of the descent is being violently rewritten into the path of salvation. Jacob must walk into the nightmare so his descendants can walk out as an army. He is given permission to cross the line. The geography is unlocked. Permission is granted. The embargo is lifted. But a terrified patriarch needs more than a green light to walk his family into an empire of chains. The Egyptian drivers adjust the heavy leather harnesses on the royal wagons, their patience wearing thin in the Canaanite dark. Jacob is no longer frozen by the ancient prohibition of his father. The geographic embargo is lifted, but a deeper, silent terror remains anchored in his chest. In the ancient world, deities were tied to their dirt. To leave the borders of a nation was to walk out from under the covering of its god. If Jacob rides those wagons south, does he leave the divine presence standing alone at the altar? Genesis chapter 46, verse 4, shatters that fear with a single, staggering sentence. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. Stop right there. I will go down with thee. Read that again. The King James captures the quiet magnitude of the Hebrew. The Creator does not say he will watch from heaven. He does not say he will send an angel to guard the caravan. He uses the exact same terrifying verb that held Isaac back at this very border. Yarad, to descend, to sink. God takes the cursed verb of the exile and applies it directly to himself. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan The ancient Aramaic translation and commentary read in the early Judean synagogues pulls back the veil on the sheer scale of this promise. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. The Targum translates this verse not just as an offer of protection, but as a cosmic shift in reality. It reads, "I will go down with thee into Egypt by my Shekinah." The Shekinah, the physical, dwelling, resting glory of the Most High. Sit with that. He thought he was asking for a protective blessing over a dangerous road. He did not know he was watching the God of Abraham volunteer for captivity. The creator of the universe is agreeing to become an exile. He is taking the divine presence and stepping into the iron furnace alongside a trembling shepherd. Watch what the text does. The altar at Beersheba was built as a boundary stone. Jacob built it to say a desperate goodbye to the land of promise. But the voice in the night dismantles the boundaries of ancient religion. God is proving that his presence is not fused to the soil of Hebron. He is binding himself to the fragile, frightened bloodline of Israel. Where the wagons go, the Shekinah goes. Where the chains eventually fall, the presence descends. Same God, new territory. The fear of the southern border is dissolving into the desert air. The transport of Pharaoh is no longer a carriage to a pagan wasteland. It is the vessel carrying the presence of heaven into the dark. God has sworn to walk into the exile with him. The descent is settled. The Shekinah is moving south. But the second half of that verse holds a vow that stretches hundreds of years past this old man's lifespan, promising a physical impossibility. How can a patriarch who knows he will take his last breath in a foreign country be promised a return trip to the land he is leaving? The night wind off the Negev desert catches the embers of the altar. Jacob is no longer staring at a boundary line he is terrified to cross. The Creator has just volunteered to walk into the exile with him. The Shekinah is moving south, but the voice speaking out of the visions of the night does not stop with the descent. It immediately anchors the old patriarch to an impossible return. Genesis chapter 46, the second half of verse 4. "And I will also surely bring thee up again." Stop right there. Surely bring thee up. Look closely at the physical reality of the man kneeling in the dust. Jacob is 130 years old. His body is breaking down. He knows, with the cold clarity of a shepherd who has watched generations turn to dust, that he will never walk the hills of Hebron again. He knows he is going to take his last breath in a foreign country. So, how can the God of truth look at a dying man and promise to bring him singular, Jacob himself, back up from the Egyptian furnace? Turn the English back into the Hebrew. The phrase is alo ya'ale. It is a double verb. Literally, ascending. I will make you ascend. It is an emphatic, guaranteed double ascent. Watch what the text does. The Targum pseudo-Jonathan. The Aramaic translation, read aloud in the ancient synagogues, unlocks the dual nature of this vow. It reads, "I will bring you up, and you shall be buried in the land of Canaan, and I will also cause your children to return." Two ascents, one literal, one national. God is promising that Jacob's bones will not be left to the pagan dirt. He will die in Goshen, but he will not stay in Goshen. And centuries later, his bloodline will follow that exact same trajectory out of the chains. The Exodus does not begin with Moses standing barefoot at a burning bush. The Exodus begins right here, in the blackness of Beersheba, with a promise made over the blood of slaughtered cattle. Sit with that. Jacob thought his choice was between starving in Canaan or surrendering the covenant to Egypt. He thought going south meant the end of the story, but God is writing a resurrection over the exile. The Egyptian wagons idling at the edge of the camp will carry a living patriarch down into the shadow of slavery. But a different procession will one day carry his embalmed bones back across this exact same border, right past this very altar, to rest in the cave of Machpelah. Same man, same border, two crossings. The paralyzing fear of the geography is utterly broken. The 400-year nightmare of his grandfather Abraham has been framed inside a divine rescue mission. The geopolitical terror is settled. God has spoken to the destiny of a nation and the trajectory of an empire. But a grieving father needs more than a geopolitical map to finally heal. Before heaven goes silent again, the voice in the night adds one final, microscopic detail to this massive covenant. A detail so intimate, so devastatingly personal, it breaks the heart of the old patriarch wide open. What is the physical promise the Creator makes about the hands of the boy Jacob thought was dead? The voice in the night finishes the massive geopolitical covenant not with the destiny of a nation, but with the quiet, physical touch of a son. Genesis chapter 46, the end of verse 4. And Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. Stop right there. The eyes. For 22 years, Jacob's eyes have wept for a shattered body he could not bury. He was told a wild beast devoured his boy. He spent 2 decades imagining claws, fangs, and a lonely, violent death in the dirt of Dothan. But God reaches into the darkest room of the patriarch's trauma and rewrites the ending. Joseph is not only breathing, Joseph will be the one standing at Jacob's deathbed. I hold this as one reading, not the final word, but it is the ultimate restoration. God is not just returning a lost son, he is returning the dignity of a peaceful death. Joseph will perform the ancient, intimate rite of closing his father's eyelids when the final breath leaves his lungs. Go back now to the boundary line where this film began, the heavy Egyptian wagons idling in the dust, the old man kneeling by the ashes of the slaughtered cattle, the absolute, paralyzing terror of the southern border. You have read that scene 100 times and thought it was just a travel delay, a quick sacrifice before a family reunion. But tonight, you know exactly what was holding him to the ground. You know he was staring down the 400-year nightmare of his grandfather. You know he was terrified of breaking the geographic command given to his father. But the scene has changed. The wagons are no longer a hearse carrying him into a cursed exile. They are the royal escort carrying the Shekinah into the dark. The God of the covenant has just volunteered for the chains, stepping into the iron furnace alongside a trembling shepherd just to forge a nation. Jacob stands up from the altar. He will step onto that wagon. He will cross the line. The descent is finally happening, and the 400 years of slavery are waiting in the shadows of the Nile. The fire is coming, and the desert is still holding the rest of what that darkness will cost them. If you made it to the end, comment the word watched so I know who the deep readers are. Subscribe because we are uncovering the forgotten architecture of these texts every week, and send this to one person who loves the Old Testament but has never heard the silence of Beersheba broken. A man can walk into any darkness so long as the Creator is walking into it with him.